Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session on ESG. How many of us are familiar with ESG concept? Great. How many of us are working in that space, either as a consultant or a decision maker, as a trainer? Great, perfect. So today's session is on ESG, and of course, as we are seeing the subject evolving, there is a lot of skepticism. There are people who believe in the principles of ESG. There are people who are questioning the principles of ESG. So today's session will be talking about navigating the ESG factors for sustainable returns. We have two great speakers here today with us. David. David is, I would say, one of those people who make decisions based on ESG. And we have Clifford, who help people like David to interpret those requirements and how they apply. So we'll start the session with two presentations. I invite David first, and I will request David to give a small introduction about himself, what he does, and how ESG is integrated in his day-to-day life, like in terms of his job, or how he considers ESG, how they apply. And we will open the floor for a few questions from the audience. After that, I will invite Clifford to do the same. Brief introduction, talk about ESG. And Clifford's presentation is going to focus more on the legal aspects of it, how those legal frameworks are evolving, how they apply. And if you want questions regarding how those could be interpreted, perhaps we can have a few minutes to discuss on those topics as well. And towards the end of his presentation, we'll do the same thing, audience questions, and then I have some pre-prepared questions as well that we will share if the time permits. Great, so floor is yours.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Good morning, everyone. So thank you, Yogi, for the introduction. Thanks to Eco Impact for inviting me to be here this morning, and thanks to Clifford for the opportunity for us to work together. As Yogi said, my name's David Brock. I'm the Vice President of Energy Security at the Crown Investments Corporation in Saskatchewan. I'll tell you a little bit about what that means, but effectively what my responsibility is, first of all, I am but a humble civil servant. So in contrast to Yogi's introduction, I am not a decision maker, but I advise and serve decision makers, being the elected and appointment government of Saskatchewan. Primarily, the responsibilities of me and my team are for modeling, developing policy positions, and then advocating for the government of Saskatchewan on electricity policy, natural gas policy, and the policy related to nuclear energy. And I'm going to touch on probably all three of those themes in my opening remarks. So maybe just to start off, well, we're not getting, there we go. So I'll give brief opening remarks, get to whatever questions Yogi may have. I know Clifford and I are both looking forward to your questions, and then turn it over to my colleague for his opening statement. But the title of this brief opening is Weighing and Counting. So I want to talk a little bit about the public sector, and particularly public sector enterprise and ESG. And I'll explain to you what I mean by the weighing and counting. First of all, this opening slide is by design excruciatingly boring. And what I want to try to do in my opening remarks is to bore you. The reason for this is, in part, that ESG has become such an incredibly inflamed and provocative set of three little letters that I think both Clifford and I want to take some of the heat out of the conversation and add a little more light. Very briefly, and perhaps the slides will be available to you through the organizers afterwards, but what this overlays is what's the commercial Crown sector in Saskatchewan, for which the Crown Investments Corporation is responsible on behalf of the government. So a couple things about that. CIC is the holding company on behalf of the government of Saskatchewan for our large commercial Crown corporations, including Sask Power, Sask Energy, SaskTel, some companies you may be familiar with, particularly for those of you who are from Alberta, or perhaps even if there's anyone in the room from Saskatchewan. And as the holding company, part of what our responsibility to do is not only oversight of the sector, but also providing policy direction to the sector on behalf of the government of Saskatchewan, and CIC has been doing that since 1978. Okay, quickly, just in terms of kind of my understanding of ESG, I find this helpful to think about in terms of two concepts: ESG as process and ESG as product. And what I mean by that, ESG as process is really thinking about the materiality of risk. And so when it comes to any particular sector or commodity or company, how one both measures and assesses what risk is tied to that is the process part of ESG. And I think that's something we're going to get into in considerable detail over the next hour, and I know Clifford will touch on that a little bit in his opening remarks. Whereas, somewhat by contrast, ESG as product is more about what is the sector, what is the commodity, what is the product. And that's a very different conversation about ESG. So we're thinking about ESG as process. Really, it's about an analysis of risk within the product or commodity or company itself. Whereas ESG as product is actually choosing between different things. And perhaps among the most controversial would be something like oil. If you're looking at oil as a process, then perhaps it's on the comparability of emissions per barrel or whatever other metrics are being used. Those who are looking at it as ESG as product may hold a kind of a fundamental objection to oil as a commodity at all because they don't see it in the fit of ESG. I'm not making an argument one way or the other. I'm not advocating for either. What I'm trying to do is set a context for our conversation here today. Okay, to the points about weighing and counting. The first point I want to make is a lot of the conversation around ESG is happening external to governments. Primarily, it's about conversations between particularly accountants. It's being done by a variety of boards or entities, many of which I have a hard time remembering what they are. They're mostly at the international or the national level. But for governments, what we need to think about is what is the mandate of a commercial crown corporation that's defined by law. So certainly boards of directors for crown corporations and the executive teams need to pay attention to what's happening in the operating environment and need to be aware of trends in investment. But primarily their mandate is set by the legislature through law and ultimately controlled by government. And this has to be always the primary point of reference for those people who are controlling commercial crown corporations. So I say that because as it relates to public enterprise, a lot of our conversation today I expect is going to turn on what we're seeing around things such as standards, investor pressures, ideology, expectations. But governments and for public enterprises have made very clear what is the mandate of a commercial crown corporation or a state-owned enterprise through the law. And those directors and executives responsible for that crown corporation always have to adhere to that legislative and government direction. Secondly, to the point about counting, a lot of the conversation about counting is done by accountants and through things like standards. I just wanted to add one other element to that, particularly those of you who are thinking about it from an investor perspective, and that is to say that not only markets in terms of things like stock markets matter, but also the construct of a market matters. And here's where I'm going to start to shift a little bit to talking about a particular area, and that is the electricity market. Again, particularly for those of you who are from Alberta, you'll know that the electricity market here in Alberta looks a lot different than it does next door in Saskatchewan. So in Saskatchewan, we have a state-owned monopoly, completely vertically integrated through Sask Power, one of our commercial crown corporations, whereas in Alberta, you have a decentralized, regulated, energy-only market. How one thinks about investment in electricity in those two different markets alone would vary considerably when applying ESG, and then look at the range of electricity markets across the country with this slide helps point out. So one needs to think about the specific market context in which one is making an investment. And when I talk about markets, we're not only talking about stock markets, we're also talking about the structure of the market involved. To spend just a little bit more time on electricity and maybe to try to illustrate this, I want to close off by talking a little bit about nuclear power because I think it's a good fit between both market type as well as the conversations on ESG and related conversations around, say, green investments or green bonds. First of all, just the point, the incredible momentum and pace on interest in nuclear just over the past few years is something that I struggle to keep up with, and I have members on the team who work on this full time. But of course, this is of great advantage to Canada as a whole that has a very strong background in nuclear energy, both at the power level and particularly through things like the older CANDU reactors, now the development of small modular reactors, but also at the research level and the export of uranium, for which Saskatchewan alone is the second largest producer in the world. But the momentum is international as well, and there's some illustrations of that. Part of the reason for that is a recognition of the possibility for the use of nuclear energy for electricity generation that is low or non-emitting. But that has been controversial, of course, of whether it's constituted as green. And what helps illustrate that is just the change we've seen in the past few years. So in 2021, the EU excluded nuclear from sustainable finance, and then in 2022, it was included in their taxonomy. In Canada, it was excluded from the Green Bond Framework, and it is now included. And just in December of last year, we had 22 countries, including Canada, and many of our allies, such as the United States and France, arguing for a tripling of nuclear capacity by 2050, purposely to align with countries' net zero expectations. And those 22 countries also called upon banks for a stronger recognition of nuclear as a green or ESG-friendly type of investment. The purpose about this is less to advocate for nuclear as a set, it's to make the point about looking at particular markets and the change that we've seen in those markets, even in the past 3 years. With that, I'm very much looking forward to Clifford's opening remarks, and particularly the questions from you, Yogi, and from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was quite informative and very different than, as a non-investment person, how we look at it. Any questions from the audience? Because for me, there are quite a few key points or key takeaways. Like when you say ESG is as a process or ESG as a product, I never thought it that way. Like for me, ESG is like something that is integrated into my any business or any activity that we are doing. So by extension, it could be for me as a process. So I will come back to this point, ESG as a process or as a product. But in the meantime, any questions from the audience?
Good, I've suitably bored them.
I know. So, David, from an investor's perspective, do you see ESG as a risk management strategy, or you see ESG is something which is giving you returns on the investment?
Yeah, no, that's a difficult question, I think. And I think theoretically it is both. I think some of the origins, as I understand it, of the ESG argument were initially about the management of risk, and I think particularly the work done by the Task Force on Climate Disclosures by primarily Mr. Carney and Mr. Bloomberg. So, thinking about, for investors, protections against physical and transformational risks, to me, makes sense from just a risk mitigation perspective in an age of a changing climate. On returns, I asked a friend who has much greater expertise in this than I do before coming to this session, what should I be thinking about? And her good advice was follow the money, right? So as it relates to both risk and return, I was struck by an article published late last year with a suitably provocative title, Guns, Gas, and Governments, the Financial Costs of Anti-ESG Policies, by a gentleman named Daniel Garrett out of the Wharton School. And basically what he looked at is what was the cost in the aggregate to municipal financing in Texas, because there was a decree that municipalities could not use large investors who had favorable ESG policies. And what he found through that research was the cost was an additional $300 to $500 million on the borrowing of about $32 billion. The reason for that is not necessarily that these were lesser performing firms, so they're not the BlackRocks that one might be, or Goldman Sachs, but it was more so around what it does to market competition. And so when there's a clear signal to the investor market that any firms that favor ESG will not receive those contracts, then the others in the market know that they can probably increase the price for weighing into that market, right? So I think that's an element of both the risk and return, and one that governments and others need to weigh carefully before we make public statements making pronouncements for or against ESG as product or process.
Great. I believe you answered my second question, so what are the factors or criteria you consider when you go for an investment?
Maybe I'll just give a simple answer as a bit of a segue to Clifford, and that is, I don't think we know.
Oh, right.
So, there is massive uncertainty, I think, for investors right now for a variety of reasons, but, one of the top line is that we haven't yet seen, either through the international standards boards or yet the adoption of standards at the national level, including in Canada, what exactly those standards will be.
Right.
And as it relates to that, even the ratings agencies don't yet have a consistent approach on what they characterize as ESG. I think they've been pretty open about that and say it's something that's under development for each of them. But it's what a team at MIT have coined aggregate confusion, right? Because we haven't yet arrived on a consistent set of standards, and I think that in itself introduces risk for investors.
Great, yeah. No, that's great, because this consistency in the standards is a major issue which ESG as a whole is struggling with. And every day we keep on coming across, there are so many new standards coming up, reporting standards coming up. And this is not a new concept. Like, this is something which has been there in early 80s or early 90s as well. But we had been just changing the names. We started with sustainability reporting or CSR reporting, and the same concepts, they gradually started evolving into the ESG. And we know 5 years from now there would be something different, but probably the fundamentals and principles remain the same. So moving on to Clifford. So Clifford will be talking about some legislations and which are upcoming ones and how they could be interpreted. Over to you, Clifford.
Thank you. My name is Clifford Andrew Sukai, and just to put myself into context, I am an international lawyer, and what gives me the power to say that is that I'm originally trained in the United Kingdom as a lawyer. I then was called in Trinidad and Tobago, and then in Guyana, and then in Saskatchewan, and thereafter in Alberta. What is interesting about these jurisdictions is that I follow the oil and gas industry, if you look at the jurisdictions. Now, it's sad that I have to follow David with his colorful slides, because my slides are literally black and white, and I have to prevent anybody from falling asleep. So that's my first task. Now, what I will be doing is, my job is to talk about the impact and the trends affecting the ESG market. Now, I will briefly go through what affects the market structure, but I will spend a little more time on the trends in ESG. And for obvious reasons, I would lean towards the legal framework. So in terms of what affects the market, we have increased awareness. Certainly everybody's talking about ESG. It's the buzzword, and I can tell you in my cross-border collaborations with my clients, ESG is either a topic that would be spoken about at length or will not be spoken at all. So we have a variation in terms of ESG being a topic, but certainly it is there's increased awareness as it relates to sustainability issues. Certainly we are seeing also investor activism. What we're seeing is a lot of investors asking about sustainability practices as it relates to making their investment. And the area that I like the most, we are seeing the legislature through legislations and regulators through regulations actually having an impact on the market as it relates to ESG. Now, what I'll tell you is that I believe genuinely as a practitioner that this is a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach, and I'll explain. Now, again, this is a bit wordy, so I will try to explain, and some of these things are important. This Bill C-97 is really important to me because where we started when we started ESG, the area of great civil litigation was a misunderstanding of what stakeholder interest represents. The shareholder and the traditional view is that a shareholder has primary interest in the corporation. I will tell you that Bill C-97 expanded that meaning and also amended the Canadian Business Corporation Act. And I just have a little bit of an excerpt from that, which is the fiduciary duty that's supposed to be or is supposed to be exercised by the directors or the officers of a corporation is in the best interest of the corporation. So the stakeholder has been expanded. Now, I heard my colleague said that his advisor told him to follow the money. I'm afraid ESG is contrary to that, because what this amendment has done is it has brought an end to the debate of value. My colleague's advisor, maximization of profits versus values, which is there are other interests, And another important thing is that shareholder usually would have been exclusive. Shareholders are now inclusive. We talk about employers, we talk about the community, we talk about other stakeholders. Now, it will be remiss of me as being a practitioner if I don't mention the case, the BCE case. And the reason why I have that case up there is because the Supreme Court of Canada in 2008 changed the definition as it relates to a shareholder versus a stakeholder or stakeholders. So since 2008, there was a case, and if I can just quickly say the facts, there was a shareholder resolution where 90% of the shareholders wanted to go in a particular direction. However, the directors and the officers of the company took the company in a different direction, or the corporation in a different direction, preferring to address the other stakeholders beyond the shareholder. So since 2008, the Supreme Court has had an impact on ESG reform. Now, this is something that I see most of my clients seem to not be aware of, and a lot of corporations are not aware of, but there is an obligation that exists where it relates to reporting, and that's under the Employment Equity Act. Corporations must report under these 4 designations their equity plan as it relates to inclusiveness and take into consideration those 4 categories. So it's already there. Under the Canadian Security Administrators, they are regulators of the bank and insurers, and they have actually inserted their presence in the space by providing guidelines. This has been one of the bills that I think is getting a lot of attention, simply because there is a reporting component and a first round which is due by May 2024. This bill deals with supply chain reporting as it relates to child and forced labor. Now, this is really important because non-compliance can lead to penalties. Summary offenses, it can also lead to an audit being conducted on companies, and there's a fine of up to 250 Ks. Now, the first round is only targeting publicly traded companies and their criteria. I think, if my memory serves me right, it's an asset base of 20 million and a revenue of 40 million Canadian dollars. Yep. So we have other ESG reporting, banks and insurers. That's where the CSA have inserted themselves again under the OSFI, which is the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institution Regulation B15. Again, it's not law, but it's regulation. Large corporations as well under I think it's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is now under the purview of the International Sustainable Standard Board. So things are changing in the environment. So there is going to be disclosure, and there must be disclosure by larger corporations by September 2025. Now, some of the concerns when we think about ESG reporting certainly would lend itself, and I see someone yawning. Am I boring you? Sorry. That's okay. So greenwashing and misrepresentation. Obviously, we know the big four who has made that error. I will not call their names, but some bigger names have actually been very guilty and culpable of greenwashing, making false claims. That is something we need to be very mindful of as well. ESG, because of varying positions, contrasting positions, it's highly litigious, highly. And I'm glad that the Bill C-97 has cleared up the issue with regards to the shareholders. That has been really significant. Moving on to some other trends, I think by definition, and I heard one of the questions asked of David, I think it is fair to say that ESG strategies help mitigate risk. That is my position, and I understand that businesses are now incorporating these strategies, if only to mitigate their risk. Other trends, investor focus. Investors are becoming more in tune and placing greater emphasis on understanding ESG strategies. We have technology. We see a lot of tools coming out. There are implications for those tools, but there are a lot of tools and data sharing that's coming up. As a legal practitioner, I'm concerning myself with data privacy and even cybersecurity. Stakeholder engagement, we see that as part of the process, where I don't know where that 222 comes from, but it was an error. So it has no meaning. Well, at least that woke up everybody, so that's good. So yes, so stakeholder engagement, just minus that 222, it's part of the process. So companies are now engaging stakeholders and getting involved in all the decision making as it relates to business operation. Now, what does it mean as a practitioner? We don't have an organization per se, so we offer the advice. And this is how I believe as a practitioner we can assist, or legal firms can assist. Certainly we assist in creating awareness, compliance, and also in terms of risk management. I think we also have a part to play in terms of the development of contracts. It's good to insert these clauses now in your contracts in terms of your partnerships. It's important to include as well. I guide my clients in terms of bringing notice to the Bill C-98 when constructing their USAs to be very careful and insert those clauses because it is significant. Obviously, as practitioners as well, we can be advisors. We can advocate on behalf of policies wherever we identify a gap. And certainly, I think we could put ourselves in a position where we could educate in terms of creating awareness. And I thank you.
Thank you, Clifford. That was quite interesting because I didn't see anybody sleep. And
saw someone yawn.
Now, that was very informative because in ESG, as it evolved initially, we saw it was mostly market-driven. It was initially used as a PR exercise, and how we have seen the legislation have been doing that catch-up game. And Bill S-211 is such a great example. And we are so far behind compared to what rest of the world is doing. This just came into force in January 2024. And by May 24, there is an obligation on the companies to start reporting on their supply chain performance. Now, how does that impact for practitioners like us? It creates a new business opportunity because this will really, now how this applies to all publicly listed companies. Clifford mentioned it, there is another threshold. There are three criteria: one, 20 million in assets in last 2 years, 40 million in the revenue in last 2 years, or 250 employees. If any of those two are met, you are mandated to report on it. Now, look at the supply chain. In Canada, we never talked about supply chain issues per se. Most of the time we focused on some human rights regulations that apply here, but this legislation specifically talks about child labor and forced labor. That means all the material we are buying at Walmart, all the material we are buying at, say, Loblaws or anywhere which is manufactured outside, now they have to start reporting, and that creates an opportunity for our auditors here. So I see many of us are here auditors, so definitely. So please reach out to Clifford and ask him how to tap into the market. So Clifford, thank you for bringing those legislation, and I see there are some reporting requirements. So A quick follow-up question on what you just told me. Talked about investor activism. Can you share some examples of investor activism and how they have regulated or maybe influenced the market in ESG space?
Well, I think there's what we call a demand push. It's inevitable because of the legal landscape and because things are changing as it relates to mandatory reporting, as it relates to being held accountable. I think investors are placed in the position where they are responding to the landscape, the legal landscape, and the questions that are being asked. The fact that the fiduciary responsibility or the fiduciary duty as well has been expanded, it brings other stakeholders into the conversation, and I think they're asking the questions. So it would be foolish if investors and institutional investors, by way of proxy voting, would ignore these demand push that is coming from the market.
It's interesting. Any follow-up? Yeah.
You spoke of technology and for ESG reporting that is coming up. Do you have any concrete examples of what that might be, and most importantly, who's creating that, who's developing it, and then who's going to regulate that activity?
That's a good question because I will say something that's controversial. Whenever I'm asked what is ESG, and I shared with two of my colleagues in this conference, and I said it's a bunch of issues that you throw up, and a few has landed. Those that have landed are those that we are dealing with, but there are many issues that are unanswered and many issues that are now being developed. In terms of standardization, I will tell you there is no standardization. In terms of objectivity, I will tell you in each of the areas, there's no objectivity. A lot of things are being developed. And when you deal with something like international trade, you have variations in terms of how things are treated, methodologies. I'm getting to your question. We are in the stage where a lot of things are being developed. So even these tools that are coming out, we still have to figure out, because we have an issue of data privacy, we have an issue of cybersecurity. So these tools that are coming out, in my view, in the absence of having standardized legislation and having any sort of oversight, I believe there are a lot of tools that are coming out, and my fear is that we need the legislature to come ahead and treat with having oversight over some of these tools. So I don't have an answer to some of the tools that you're asking for. In terms of the development, I think a lot of people are seeing it as an opportunity. A lot of IT companies are seeing it as an opportunity, and that's kudos to them, but I think we need to have that regulated as well. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah.
No, great answer, Clifford, and that just is a reminder, never ask a question from a lawyer until you know the answer. Yeah.
Can I amplify that point on one thing? Linda Colley, who's an historian at Princeton, wrote a book called The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen about the spread of constitutions in the late 19th century. What does that have to do with your question, ESG, you're wondering? She talks about constitutions as a technology. So I think what you're getting at is computers and data and big servers and all that stuff, and I appreciate why. But I think what you're saying is very, very important to think about law and regulation and standards in and of themselves as a technology, and the nascent development of those, for which I've expressed as well as Clifford, I think is really important to consider a priori of what the machines are that's going to be doing the counting that follows what's kind of the framework for that counting.
I was also interested about the conflicts of interest and who's creating these tools, and are they going to be is the industry going to be creating the tools to then regulate itself, or is it third party businesses, or is it that's what most of what I was asking.
No, and again, there is no easy answer to that, if I can just jump in. Because when you look at technology, it can have different kind of interfaces when you talk about ESG. How are you applying the technology to mitigate certain risks? Or how are you using those technology to promote your ESG communication or ESG activities? Or another factor that comes into it, like a lot of times, I don't know if you noticed that, Google employees putting pressure on their company to not do businesses with certain entities because, oh, you are providing the facial recognition software to so and so place, where this facial recognition software is not doing good to certain communities. So it depends from what perspective you look at, like how that technology is impacting the ESG space, and there will be different answers. So connect with Clifford after that. Thank you.
Hi, Clifford, that was a really great overview in terms of, the ESG space and kind of, what's happening, what the issues are. I guess just a quick clarification, quick comment, and a quick question. Clarification on Canada's Modern Slavery Act. So we talked about, in-scope entities. So that's one thing, right? You can be a publicly listed company or the 20 million in revenue and 40 million in assets. That just means you're an in-scope entity. But to be a reporting entity, you have to be a producer of goods. So it's not services, it's goods, or you're importing goods into Canada. So there's the in-scope entity aspect, and then there's the reporting entity aspect. On the issue of, ESG being a risk mitigation exercise, absolutely it is. But to move beyond regulatory compliance, there's a value proposition. Does ESG generate alpha? It's still unequivocal, but it can. Which leads me to the question. To a question that I have for both of you is, we talk about the regulatory drivers of ESG, but in terms of the investor drivers, maybe it's some people may not understand. Like, what are the drivers from investors in terms of ESG performance in companies, and how do investors engage with their portfolio companies to drive ESG performance?
You lost me at some point, but I'll try to answer your question. When we talk about what drives the investor, I think we have where sustainable practices does lead to financial outperformance. We have where there's the interest in having long-term effects in terms of driving trade. Those are just two that I can think of right now, in addition to being reactive to legislation and stakeholder interests. But those two that I've just mentioned, it is a proven fact, and there are many success stories where this financial outperformance as an indicator, I think it's a ratings now, companies, and there's a report out, forgive me because I don't like speaking without having the authority, but I read something where, it could be Bloomberg, where these financial outperformances were companies that employed these sustainability practices. So as an investor, when you see that, it makes good sense to invest. And that's why I'm in opposition with my colleagues, friend advisors, when they say follow the money, because I do believe it's more than just following value maximization of profits, but it's following values, purpose and things that are meaningful in terms of the long term. So that's kind of where I can answer you. Investors as well, you have to be mindful, and it would be silly if I don't mention this. There are things called stewardship guidelines for institutional investors and proxy voting, where there's a great bit of transparency as well, and that's exposing the BlackRocks and the Street State and the companies that are acting in a particular manner. And I can go down that rabbit hole, but I won't be trapped.
Maybe just two things in response. I think to both parts of your question, it probably depends on the level of analysis. So I haven't abandoned my friend yet, and will continue to follow the money. There's a forthcoming paper by Alves et al. Entitled "Drawing Up the Bill: Is ESG Related to Stock Returns Around the World?" So this is one of those large data studies that's coming out, and effectively their answer is no. Those who have prioritized ESG in the aggregate, looking across 8 countries, as much data as they could pull together, found that returns were lower. But back to Yogi's original question about risk, if one wants to think about risk in particular sectors, investing in the potash sector in Canada, primarily, if not exclusively in Saskatchewan, one is looking not only at 50% lower emissions intensity for the production of potash compared to anywhere else in the world, but also an incredibly stable investment environment because it's Canada, right? Or looking at investing in uranium, where a country like Cameco is the largest single employer of Indigenous people in the country, but also they're producing a product, as I mentioned, that increasingly financial institutions are looking at, not only for net zero returns, but also for as a growth industry in nuclear technology, and particularly small modulars. And again, the example of agriculture in Saskatchewan, which not only has incredibly sustainable practices in things like zero till, but also is operating in a highly sustainable environment, both in Saskatchewan and in Canada. So if one looks at it in the total aggregate, thinking about ESG and its overall returns, I think some of the evidence is showing that maybe the returns aren't quite as high. But if you want to mitigate risk and look at sustainability, particularly in certain sectors like uranium, agriculture, critical minerals, one is wise to think about the E, the S, and the G, and how those investments in Canada can solidify those returns.
Very well put it, because it's definitely a push and pull both, and that's how industry or investors are responding to it. Any follow-up questions?
Quick question on your thoughts on ESG becoming now mandatory and under regulation versus voluntary and part of an overall corporate decision for their clients, for their investors, for their the market, versus this approach that that governments are going toward in Europe and Canada.
Maybe I can just make two quick comments and I'll look to you, Clifford. Yeah. One is, I think it's really important to pay attention, particularly for Canadians, to where the United States is going, in part because they have not adopted IFRS reporting standards. They're still under the old GAAP system. And so obviously just the size of companies in and coming out of the United States, the size of capital markets, the influence of New York Stock Exchange or the major rating agencies, the United States of America matters in the global economy, and it matters exceptionally highly to Canadians because we're in a North American integrated economy, and the success of the United States for the past 300 years or so, going back to beaver pelts, is also our success. So thinking about the role in the United States and where they're going in relation to these international standards, I think it's yet to be seen, and typically the United States is sometimes reluctant for reasons of domestic politics to sign on to international agreements. It doesn't mean that they're not following the same trajectory and going the same way, and that may be led by private companies and markets and citizens more so than their federal government. The second one is then back to Canada. I think there's a really important, well, there is in law a really important role for provincial securities regulators, because even with cooperation between, I think it's now 8 provinces on securities regulation, we don't have a national securities regulator. That took 2 trips to the Supreme Court of Canada to figure out we weren't going to go that way. We have a high level of cooperation between most provinces on securities regulation, but it's still something that's regulated at the provincial level. And so I think paying attention to provincial politics and provincial regulatory structures will matter a lot for Canadians when they think about, or foreign direct investment in this country.
And if I can be mischievous, my colleague mentioned the US, and if we want to understand position or difference in position, we just need to look at the state of Florida versus the state of Miami, in terms of the varying positions as it relates to ESG policies. I hope to God Canada doesn't follow the United States, but to answer your question, that's something I thought about, and me being a creature of legislation, I have to follow legislation. And then I asked myself, what informs legislation? And that's policy. Who invokes policy is the government of the day. If the government of the day, their policy is to advocate for ESG, that's going to be reflected in the legislation. And that's kind of where it's going to lead. So I hope I've answered your question. Is ESG a policy-driven factor, or is it a science-based equitable factor? And I think that's the debate, if that makes any sense. Yeah?
Thank you. Building off of that, very loud. So how would you feel about the fact that the IFRS standards, even though they may not be taken up by the Canadian Security Commissioners, they are the latest attempt to try to standardize the reporting and the carbon accounting process that we're lacking. There was the alphabet soup and all the challenge of the scope emission reporting, which did not have a common methodology, and that's the ISSB's standards has been the latest attempt to try to standardize that. How would you see that as a successful attempt? That was one of my questions, and the next question is for Clifford. I'm new to the Bill C-97, and I was curious how would that enable the general stakeholders in terms of the driving the investors and the corporation? So.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because I can't answer your first question.
You go first.
So I will go first. With regards to, because the definition of the shift from the shareholder being the primary interest group, previously the shareholder by virtue of a resolution would say this is what we want in terms of the direction of the company. Bill C-98 has said the directors will now have a fiduciary duty and do that which is in the best interest of the corporation. And it actually is a stem or a limb, or it takes its lead from the Supreme Court's decision in BCE, which says there are more important stakeholders than just the shareholder. So the community is important. The employee is important. Other interest groups, and what's important to note is that C-97 has also said that list is not exhaustive. In fact, it can be expanded upon. So it creates a nice opportunity. Whoever has an interest has an opportunity to present. And I think it would be foolish if officers who have that fiduciary duty, who has C-97 and the amended Section 122 of the Canadian Business Corporation Act, have that in front of them and to ignore it. I think it would be to their peril. And I think it's going to be an opportunity for civil litigation. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe if I can just build on that, particularly from the...
No, you answer your own question.
Well, I will. From the public sector perspective, and again, I'll use the example of Saskatchewan. So right now in the Crown sector, we have 2 Crown corporations that are publicly reporting. I wouldn't say it's on ESG per se, but it's certainly on sustainability and following standards. So SaskPower following the climate financial disclosures model, Sask Energy, our natural gas distribution company, following a different model, but even their board has, I think they only have 4 committees, and one of them's an ESG committee, so they're paying a lot of attention. Sask Energy has annual sustainability reporting. Saskatchewan government insurance, the insurance industry is paying a lot of attention to ESG and sustainability, and people are paying attention to ESG as it affects those investor decisions on everything from the cost of reinsurance to available coverage for insurance right now, for example, in floodplains for housing. Part of what then we'll look to do, and we are looking to do in the Crown sector led by CAC, is to look at the likelihood and potential for common reporting in the Crown sector in Saskatchewan. That also needs to be consistent with investor expectations for investment into companies like SaskPower, because we have things like public-private agreements for renewables development. Right? In doing so, we're also undertaking kind of the standard process of things like materiality assessment, which in itself is internal, and Yogi, as you said to me earlier, is subjective by nature. A lot of this, I think, will be made easier by actually having an agreed upon standard. But it's the point of agreement where I went off and bridged back to what Clifford said, is that both the companies that are affected. I don't think it makes it a conflict of interest for them to have a view, and that's why a company like Nutrien, a Saskatchewan-based potash company, is involved in the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, and governments. It will matter to them as well, particularly for the governing of public enterprise, because, as I said at the outset, mandates matter, and it's governments who are going to be giving the direction to, particularly to publicly owned companies. So I guess the point is maybe twofold. One is having a common set of agreed upon standards, I think is kind of universally beneficial. But what are those standards should and will attract considerable interest, both from large private and public corporations, as well as from duly constituted governments in Canada and elsewhere.
Thank you, David.
Hi, Clifford and David. Thank you for an insightful presentation. I think it was good to hear both of you from different perspectives and diverse lenses. My question is to you, Clifford. What legal frameworks or mechanisms exist to ensure accountability and adherence to ESG principles across borders, especially in cases of transnational corporations?
Well, if I think hard about that, I think there is none. And I'll tell you why. Because we don't have, and anyone is free to object, because of the fact that there is no standardization, and because there are different levels of maturity in terms of different markets, because there are different cultures, there is, where we are in the evolution process of ESG, we are not there yet. For example, Europe has made leaps and bounds in terms of their ESG development. I think America and North America is catching up. I have clients coming out of, let's say, Africa, does not even want to have a conversation about ESG. So cross-border collaboration is still very challenging. However, we cannot avoid supply chain, because supply chain is global. So it does feature into the conversation. However, countries and first world countries like countries in Europe and countries in North America, they are putting into their legal landscape these legislations like S211, which brings into question you need to be accountable for your supply chain as it relates to forced and child labor. So I think first world countries are doing their part, but we are at different levels. There are variation in standards. There are difference in terms of market maturity, and there are difference in culture. So that is presenting a challenge, but I think we're getting there. The conversation is being had. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thanks.
In 2019, my wife and I went from Ukraine to Turkey. We'd been married for 10 years, and this is part of the story because it was an anniversary trip. I very much wanted to travel by train. She did not. We've been married for 10 years. We recognized we didn't need to be together for the whole trip. So I went from Ukraine to Moldova on the train down through to Sofia. When one crosses the border from Ukraine to Moldova, they literally, with you still on it, pick up the train car and move it onto different wheels, because there are not corresponding systems for the train tracks between those two countries which share a border. Why do I mention this? Because think of how long it's taken us to get to common agreement on weights and measures. And by the way, my mother still talks in Fahrenheit and feet, using the old imperial system, and so does everyone in the United States. So just the time it has taken and the pace to get to common agreement on weights and measures is remarkable. And if we think of where we're at on the ESG conversation, I think that helps put into perspective where we may be moving in terms of pace. And again, I'll reiterate, particularly for the governments and most importantly the people who live in those jurisdictions who are affected by that pace is not necessarily such a bad thing, because getting to a common agreement at a pace that excludes people, particularly in democratic systems of government, I think risks upending the entire system.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Darren Brown. I'm the owner of SFN Logic, which is an ESG risk analysis company. I get these questions a lot, and I just want to add a couple of comments to the discussion here. First off, it's really important to think of ESG as much more of a KPI. It's a key performance indicator. It's really all it is. It's just a metric. There's 34 metrics that the World Economic Forum developed, and these 34 metrics are what people in my field rely on to characterize ESG performance. The other aspect to this is that when we're talking about international legislation, right now the European Union with their organization EFRAG is developing what's called ESRAs. And these the European reporting, I can't remember the whole acronym right now, but these are the reporting requirements for Europe. Now, one of the really important parts to this, and it goes to that gentleman that asked the question earlier, is that if you're a company in Europe, but you have investments outside of your country, you are still subject to those reporting requirements, and these are continuing to develop as we go along. So the idea that the regulatory framework isn't developing and developing quickly is incorrect. It really is coming from Europe and it's coming across. The other really important part is that, and a question to the gentleman up front is, in terms of legislation, it's kind of difficult for me to understand what's going to be legislated, because if you have a key performance indicator letting you know how many tons of mercury you emit per unit, whatever you make, what are you regulating? Because it's very difficult to regulate a key performance indicator, but it's much more to these criteria and benchmarks that you're trying to achieve in general environmental sustainability and social accountability terms.
Well, I appreciate the plug, but I have to tell you that respectfully I disagree that ESG is a KPI. Respectfully, we could agree to disagree. And if I can also say respectfully, I think if you gather from what I said, that if you treat with or you trade with another country that has not recognized ESG, that absolves you from all the regulations that you're supposed to be subjected to. I'm sorry, let me clarify that. That is not what I meant. So my position is on understanding ESG. It is, for me, it is a practice. It is a strategy that you put in place with an interest in mind. And that interest could be driven by risk mitigation. That could be driven by equitable interests. And that's how I see ESG. Did I answer the first part of your question, you think?
Yeah, to an extent.
But I respectfully disagree that it's a KPI, but I appreciate the plug. Yeah.
So my question is, again, is that when you come to regulate something, what are you actually regulating? So if I have, again, 5 tons of CO2 per ton of product produced, and that's just the metric, the ESG metric of the 34 metrics with the World Economic Forum, what are you actually regulating?
I agree with my colleague, sir. And so just to give a quick example, if what comes out of the consultation by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board eventually is adopted by the Government of Canada and/or provincial governments, then one of the elements, just by way of example, could 3, whether or not Scope 3 emissions are included in climate financial disclosures. So that in itself is a big question, because even how we measure Scope 3 emissions is not entirely clear on the international level. So if Canadians made the decision to include Scope 3 emissions, that's something that would be part of that regulation. And then even beyond that, if yes, then how do we understand what constitutes Scope 3 emissions, what gets counted and what doesn't get counted? So that's one example of what could be regulated if we decide to move towards having these kind of sustainability standards further in law and regulation.
Okay, so I believe we have one last question and maybe a 30 seconds answer.
I'll ask the question quickly. So with Bill S-211 and the reporting that is required by May 2024, I have two questions. The first, what is the standard? So like if the country that we're working with, or if it's like a country that is sending us a product, are we using their labor laws or ours? Because a lot of countries don't really have labor laws introduced, or the labor laws are drastically different. So who is determining that? And the second, wait. And the second is, if the penalty is up to $250,000 and it's an organization like a clothing distribution organization like Shein that's bringing in over $1 billion, that's really nothing to them as a penalty. So what other things are going to be put into place to mitigate the detriment of what's actually happening in our trade partners?
Right. That's a provocative question. That's a good question, and that's the kind of questions I like. But I think it's my colleague in front of me, said, I can't answer that in 30 seconds because I love to talk. So maybe I can meet you and we can chat about that if you want. Yes? Yeah?
We all relate to Europe. Yeah, we do.
Okay, so the labor laws would be the laws of the jurisdiction to answer that question. 250Ks, what does that mean for a Nike? Probably nothing. But remember, we're getting there. We are getting there. So we are, I mean, how I see it, again, I can put it this way: we are developing the landscape. We are evolving, and that's why, when the young man said that he felt that it's far advanced, I don't agree, because there are many gaps, many gaps, many unanswered questions. So that's where we are. There's many things that needs to be addressed. We are at that stage. Yeah.
Maybe I could just add, because I think this is sometimes part of the provocation, not that it was in your question in any way, but ESG does not supplant the rest of the laws we have in all of the other areas that governments govern, right? It's a measure of what does and does not constitute sustainable financing, and therefore what can receive or benefit from certain investments or lower interest rates. So it governs one particular aspect of the economy and not the entirety of society. I think sometimes part of the fear, and what I think Clifford and I are both grateful we've avoided today, is a conversation where ESG has taken over elected governments in Canada. It's not.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Clifford. Thank you for all those questions. I think we still have too many questions unanswered, and coming back to S211, they are very specific to child labor and forced labor. And in case there are no legislation, very often industry refer to ILO standards. So ILO is very comprehensive in terms of all of those requirements related to human rights. Standards continue to evolve. Stakeholder expectations continue to lead to the legislation, because when you look at McDonald's Happy Meal, the fruits in the Happy Meal is because of legislation and because of those, they were subject to the court and they got sued, and because of that legislation came that they have to have a healthy meal into the kids' meal. So what we see is gradually, like stakeholder expectations, they slowly start seeping into guidelines, and then slowly they start becoming regulations, and they start becoming industry practice. And so there is no start and end line when it comes to ESG. ESG is a very broad landscape. Like we can talk about environmental, we can talk about social, we can talk about governance, but not every issue is as important, as critical to every industry or every company. So the companies decide based on their relevance, based on their materiality, based on what they feel is important to them and to their stakeholders. So thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And And in the afternoon, we have a session on a strategy session on environmental employment.